Hi everyone, this is Ben Scow with Southwest Farmer. We're going to be talking about tomatoes today, and tomatoes are one of those crops they're a lot of fun. They're also a challenge, and I like a good challenge, so I really like growing tomatoes, but there are some common problems that we see with tomatoes in the desert Southwest. So we're going to go over a couple of those problems today and how to address those the best that we can. Okay, so the first thing that we see a lot with tomatoes, and this is pretty much anywhere in the country, but we do get a lot of questions about cracking. And cracking, there's a lot of things that can cause cracking. What cracking looks like, there's two types of cracking that we can get. One is called radial cracking, which is the typical cracking that you see from the stem out. And then the other one is concentric, and it is more of it goes around more in a circular pattern. Both of them are caused more or less by the same thing, usually by inconsistent watering. So the trick to try and reduce this the most that you can is to be able to keep the soil moist and keep it consistently moist, and not having a roller coaster ride of water will cause the tomatoes to ebb and flow and get larger and cause that cracking. The other thing that you can do to reduce this is to select a variety that is resistant to cracking. Some of our varieties are prone to cracking. A lot of our heirloom varieties, that's one of the characteristics of a lot of varieties, is they do have these really deep sutures and cracks in them. So selecting a variety, if you don't want the cracking, there are some that are prone to not crack. So selecting variety can greatly reduce the cracking that you can get in tomatoes. The other thing that can cause it, and this is one that I've learned recently, is if you prune your tomatoes, and if you prune them a little bit too much, it will do the same thing. It'll cause more nutrients to go to the tomato instead of the vegetative growth, which is what we want because we want larger tomatoes. But if it is too much, it can cause the same problem. The tomato will swell a little bit faster than the skin can handle and cause it to crack. And then those dark spots that you always see, that's just the tomato healing itself. It's kind of a scab. It does open up spaces that you can get some rotting or some bacteria that will grow in that, and some molds will start to grow in that in some cases, depending on the climate. How moist or humid the air is can cause more mold and bacteria to grow than others. So that's cracking. Really common problem. We see it all the time, and I spend a lot of time with gardeners and growers on that topic. Okay, another really common problem that we see with tomatoes is called blossom end rot, and it looks absolutely disgusting sometimes. So it's a little bit deceiving. So you'll have a nice tomato that's growing, you go down to pick it, and it's only kind of half there. It's not grown all the way, and it's scabbed on the bottom. This is blossom end rot. This is an almost ripe tomato. It's a really large blossom end rot. Some of them are quite small. This one's a little bit smaller on a green tomato. It's a calcium deficiency is what causes this one. So it's not a bug, it's not a pest or a virus or a disease. This is just a physiological disorder that tomatoes get, and it's caused by calcium. So calcium is really abundant in our soils in the Southwest. We have a lot of it in most of our soils. So the question always comes up is, well, if they're not getting enough, do I need to add more? And the answer is usually no. It does depend. There are some instances where you need to, but for most people, if you're farming or growing your garden in the ground, you really don't need to add any calcium to your soil. It's more of a watering issue. And water restricts the availability of calcium. So if you have too much water, it dilutes it too much, and the roots aren't going to be taking it up. If there's not enough water, the roots cannot find the calcium to take it up. It's not mobile enough that they're able to absorb it. So this happens when the blossoms are forming at a certain stage. If there is a calcium deficiency, it'll show up in the bottom of the tomato. It's usually kind of a watery, milky type spot that will start. The cells aren't developing correctly, and it will scab over and continue to grow as the tomato expands, and that's why you get these huge spots on the bottom of your tomato as calcium deficiency and blossom end rot. And water consistency is something that you can test by kind of sticking your hands in the soil around your plants. I use a plastic mulch, a plastic row cover. So it holds the moisture in, and it helps me to be more consistent with my water, and that's one of the reasons why I switched from open bare ground to a plastic mulch type cover, is because I can regulate and monitor the moisture a lot better with tomatoes. But that's one that comes up quite a bit. Okay, in our climate, this is probably the number one problem that we see. This is sun scald. And I see pictures of this all the time. It occurs on a lot of different vegetables. tomatoes for sure. Peppers is probably the next biggest one that we see it on, especially red peppers. It's really hard to get a good red pepper because they get sun scald so easily. And that occurs when the tomatoes are exposed to a lot of sunlight and heat. This was on the outside of a plant, so you can tell the sun's going to be hitting it most directly and will basically cause that tissue to scorch. They call it necrosis, which is just a fancy word for it's dead. So that tissue will die, it'll turn white. The tomato will usually continue to expand and grow. The tomato, you can cut out the necrosis part and eat the rest of the tomato. The tomato is okay. It's just you can't market it. It's not really sellable. If you had to eat it, you definitely could. But we lose a lot of tomatoes to sun scald because we get so much direct heat here in the southwest areas. But these are just some examples of what that looks like. The trick to reducing this is to shade them in some way. There's a couple ways you can do that. One of the ways we've done here in our garden is to plant closer together, especially with peppers. But if you can plant your plants closer together, it shades them. So they have something right next to them that's going to shade everything in the middle, and you won't lose as many tomatoes to the sun scald. Better yet, if you can do something a little bit more and put in some infrastructure, you can actually build a structure that will support shade cloth or burlap. People have used burlap sacks before. Something just to shade the tomatoes. About 50% is what you're looking at for a shade cloth, so you're trying to reduce 50% of the sunlight going through. But that gives you a lot better results. You won't see very much of this if you're able to shade your tomatoes, but it does require quite a bit of infrastructure, something that's going to support that netting, that mesh that's going to be over your tomatoes. We get a lot of wind also in this area, so you have to have it secure enough that it's going to stick around when you do get some good windstorms. Okay, this last one is kind of a fun one. You don't see it a whole bunch, but it's pretty common. There's nothing you can really do to prevent it. This is called zippering on tomatoes. It's a scar. If you can see that or not. But what zippering does is these little scars that form on the side of the tomato, and this forms when the blossoms set and start to set fruit. So on a blossom, there's different parts. You have the fruit that's in the middle, the ovaries, I guess, that's part of the flower. And then you have anthers and filaments that are on the side, and the anthers are what hold the pollen up above. And basically what happens is as the fruit expands and becomes a fruit, sometimes the anthers will get stuck on the side of the fruit. And as the fruit expands, it breaks it apart and it creates that zipper kind of pattern. There's not really anything you can do with it or to prevent it or to fix it. It's just something that happens. You don't see it too often, but that's something. It's a deformity, it's a blemish that people always wonder what causes that. It's not a worm, it's not anything that's gotten in there, it's just something that happened when the tomato was forming. That's called zippering. Kind of a fun one to look at, but if you see that, that's what that's caused by. Okay, and just to wrap up with our tomatoes, there's a lot of different things that we can get problems with tomatoes. These ones they're the only thing that you can really do to fix them. A lot of it has to do with watering and being consistent is probably the biggest takeaway from this video. But one of the questions we also get that I'd like to cover is what can you do once they have these problems? One, it's a lesson for next year to try and address it for next year, but a lot of these are still edible. You can definitely still eat them. So ones like this where it has the cracking, you can cut the cracks out, you can bottle them, you can eat them, they're going to taste just fine on a sandwich, it's not a problem. The ones with sun scald, these vary on size. If it's a really large one, usually we just throw them out. You can cut the sun scald part off and eat the rest of the tomato and it should be totally fine. This one is a little bit iffy on the blossom end drop because it can vary in size. Sometimes you get this little tiny scab, it's not even the size of a penny on a really good sized tomato. You can just cut it off and you can eat it. Eat the rest of the tomato, not the scab. Eat the tomato. Once they get to be about this size, you can still cut it off and cut it back to where the flesh is still good. Most people usually just toss them, but they are still edible. You just get rid of the scab part and you're good to go on those. So that's kind of a wrap on tomatoes. Just some of the really common things that we see. We'll do some more videos in the future. And be sure if you have some comments or if there's something else you've seen that you want to learn more about, stick it in the comments and we do read those and we'll make some videos on those in the future. So thanks and we'll catch you the next time.